Hello and welcome to Enter the Boardroom with Newell, the podcast exploring what makes great boards and board members. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Newell, the board search specialist and market leader bringing science to the art of board hiring. Today's guest, Sir Ian Cheshire, is one of the UK's most experienced board leaders across retail, real estate, healthcare and public service. He is chair of Land Securities Group, the FTSE 100 Real Estate Investment Trust, chair of Spire Healthcare Group, the UK's largest independent hospital provider, chair of the King Charles III Charitable Fund, chair of the Global Corporate Climate Coalition We Mean Business, and chair of the Institute for Government. His executive career was spent in large, customer-facing businesses, culminating as Group Chief Executive of Kingfisher plc, owner of B&Q, Screwfix, Castorama and Brico Dépôt, where he led major transformation and established a reputation as a pioneer in sustainable retail. As a non-executive, he has chaired Channel 4, Barclays Bank UK, Debenhams, Manhattan Resource Efficiency and Maison du Monde, and served on the boards of BT Group and Whitbread. He was the UK government's lead non-executive director, has chaired multiple climate and environmental task forces, and is a long-standing champion of inclusion and mental health in the workplace. Sir Ian, thank you so much for joining us.
Welcome to be here.
So Ian, can we go back to your executive career? Because I'm always curious about how it shapes people's boardroom philosophy. Perhaps you could start by talking us through 3 inflection moments where a board member or board made a decisive difference, whether by challenging you, backing you, or reframing the problem as a CEO.
Yeah, and actually maybe the first example goes back even further than that, which was my first PLC board experience, listed company experience at Sears, when I was asked by Sir Bob Reid to run the demerger of Selfridges, which turned it into an independent entity, and having been the strategy M&A director before, but not been on the board. And that was the first real insight into actually it's a bit different when you're actually on the board as opposed to divisional executives or functional exec as I was. And particularly seeing how Bob ran a board up close for the entire process, because it had to be on it to see it. And the strength of his backing that we were going to get the right result of demerging Selfridges to the existing shareholders, but to create value. And it was a pretty bold move to essentially break up the previous conglomerate. And seeing that up close in person is, and I'm sure for everyone whose career develops, you can talk a lot to boards, you can often present to them, you think you know them. It's very different when you have your first real board position and you actually experience what it's like to walk in those shoes. So definitely Bob giving me an early break in my sort of, actually 40s onto a board really helped me, I think, get more understanding for when I then became CEO and then plural later. But the second one, I remember very vividly being politely beaten up by Phil Bentley, who's now the chief exec at Mighty and has been at various places, because he was my audit chair at Kingfisher. And I wasn't directly in his firing line, but I did become directly in his firing line when I became chief exec. And I couldn't quite see why he was so agitated about these controls problems he thought we were having. And because I thought, well, this is fine, the guys and the team are all right, surely that's all right. And actually, by him actually nagging me, I went back into a deep dive, had a real proper look at it and went, oh, okay, this is a problem. And it was a good example of where I think non-execs individually can really put their finger on things because they see this from a different angle. They've seen it in different businesses. And they can really pin you to the wall and say, look, you absolutely have to fix this. And Phil was great in that because also once we had fixed it, he did calm down and it wasn't just a personal vendetta. And he was right. So I learned a lot. So if I ever see non-execs noticing things, I pay quite close attention as CEO to say, right, I better go and pick this one up and look at it. And I think the final personal intervention I remember most is having been made chief exec in the teeth of the global financial crisis, just at a point when we had a rocky balance sheet and all the banks were running away. And it became clear to me that we were going to have to sell something to bring the debt down. And didn't want to sell the crown jewels because unsurprisingly people came and said, why don't you sell me Screwfix? Which when the private equity guys come calling, it essentially means you do not do that. That is the absolute contraindication. because if they want to buy it, there's a very good reason. So I ended up having to take a decision to sell our Italian business, which was painful because actually I used to run it, and it was personally, great fun. I love the people, but it had so much property sat in it. We actually ended up raising nearly £500 million, which saved the balance sheet at a point when I wasn't sure we could find any money from the existing banks, and that got us through the squeaky part of the GFC just in time. And it was really Peter Jackson then, who was the chairman, who was really helpful to me to help me think through how I was going to position it and to make it clear to the board and the business this wasn't us throwing the towel in, and we had lots of other plans for growth and improved performance. But we had to, as a matter of urgency, in less than 6 months, we had to find a solution for the balance sheet. And that meant pulling an emergency lever in the case of selling a business. And frankly, Peter's help there to get the board in the right place, to reassure the business, and also to help me think through, have I missed anything, was super helpful.
3 great examples. So that first one of giving you your first experience of the board from Bob Reed and giving you that understanding that it's very different to be on the board versus interacting. Can you bring that to life for someone listening who's perhaps in that experience you were before you had that? What is it that they don't know that once they've been in that board role, they will figure out?
I suppose there's probably two things I would say is that when you're an exec, your interactions with the board tend to be sort of episodic and you've got something to discuss. It's a thing. And what you don't see until you're at the board is the full breadth of the board's engagement across which issues. And that sense of, really believe that the board has to engage with all the issues. You can't have a specialist member who worries about the pension, or somebody who just worries about the systems, or somebody who worries about the talent. The whole board has to worry about the whole business. And obviously, some people have more to say on some topics, but it's that sense of breadth of engagement and continuous engagement. So you're constantly thinking about this, as opposed to what you would see as an exec when you show up, you have a transaction, something gets approved or not, and that's it. So that sense of it, you don't really see the working rhythm of the board until you're on it. And the second bit you don't really see is the interpersonal relationships and how the dynamics of a board work until you have enough time with them. And mostly that's good, but it can actually occasionally be, dysfunctional boards do happen. I've seen them and they're pretty majorly uncomfortable. I think the sort of key takeaway is that in your exec life, and certainly for me when I was growing up in exec, I only ever worried about the chief exec, because that's God and you have to worry about chief exec. I didn't really understand what the hell the point of the chairman was and who was this person who showed up and did these sort of strange things. And the board was some sort of weird interview process that you had to go through. And it's not until you see good and bad boards working that you realize just how much impact they can have on a business. And one of the biggest tips I've always given, I do a bit of mentoring these days, is for aspiring chief execs or people on their way to being chief exec, is really understand the importance of the board relationship. So if you get that wrong, it's actually terminal. And it's not obvious for people as they go through their exec world because you don't see the board that much. And so there's a whole, any chance I think people have of spending time around boards and actually understand what they do before they get into those positions is extremely valuable. So, and also boards like to be used. They like to be engaged. So why not engage with them?
Yeah, it's amazing how many chief execs expect the board to be psychic and wait for them to come to them rather than sharing their problems. You talk there about the board relationship and the importance of that. What exactly do you mean by that?
Well, I think it's the relationship, particularly obviously between chair and CEO, which is really fundamental. And obviously the CFO is part of that mix, and that those three need to be joined at the hip. But the broader board relationship with the rest of the business is also, I think, really important, because I think one of the things that boards should be doing is bringing their outside expertise in to sort of challenge what happens in most organizations, which people are heads down doing stuff. And the danger is that they're not heads up looking out, and you're not hearing the voice of the customer as much because businesses naturally drag you into detail. And so the strength of relationship needs to be based on two things, which is a shared positive intent that we're all here to make the business succeed. This isn't some point scoring exercise. And secondly, real expertise and not domain knowledge that the non-execs are bringing that is actually valuable for the business, but the execs need to share it. And I think one of the great dangers in some of these relationships is, depending on the personality, particularly of the CEO, CEOs feel like they have to come to boards with perfectly wrapped, ribboned answers to everything, and almost that the admission that they might not know something is a source of weakness, whereas I infinitely prefer a proper conversation which says, look, I've got my thinking to this level. I'm not sure about the following 3 or 4 things. Can we discuss this and figure out what some of the options might be? And that confidence to have that openness and the willingness to understand that that conversation will be a constructive one and it's not there to sort of cause pressure is super important. And that sense of, well, actually we are in this together to figure out the best possible answer is what good boards do.
In episode 147, Tessa Clark, who's a founder, talked about her rules of the road document that she has for her board that she refers people back to. And there are certain sort of, I suppose it's like the sort of 10 commandments that everyone signs up to. For a CEO listening to this, thinking to themselves, Ian, actually, that sounds really great. I need to get on top of that board relationship. I haven't done it. What are the practical bits of advice you would give them as to how they best go about doing that?
Well, look, 3 quick thoughts. 1, spend time building the relationship, because without a relationship, you can't engage. And it sounds really noddy, but you can't just be transactional about this and not understand who you're dealing with, who the person is. Spending time, out in the business together or out looking at other stuff together is the sort of bedrock of that relationship. So building quality relationships is absolutely sort of step number 1. Step number 2 is, I think, debating very clearly what the common agenda actually is, because quite a lot of times, the exec team are more worried about something, the board are worried about something else. And actually, you've got to get everyone onto the same page. And so this is not just a question of doing strategy days. It's more, I think, general, which I think also goes to the third point, which is, and this is a responsibility for the chair, is that are you spending the time in the board meetings on the really important stuff? And, not letting governance stuff creep up the agenda. You can take an awful lot as read. Non-execs are capable of reading things. They don't have to have it re-explained to them. But if you analyse the time spent with the board together, if the board aren't spending the time on the big strategic top 5 questions, then that's down to, firstly, the chairman, but also the CEO, I think, to make sure that that is really focused effort. And that tends to mean you end up spending the time, you've agreed you've got the relationship, you've agreed what's important, and you're spending your time on the important stuff.
Survey after survey shows board members and executives particularly don't feel like they're spending enough time on the important stuff. Reid Hoffman has this wonderful piece that he wrote on the 8 rituals of high-performing boards, and one of the tools he uses is something called the Dorian Pulse, where he gets every board member to submit their sort of questions that they think they should be discussing ahead of the board meeting, and gets everyone else to upvote or downvote each of those questions. So you come with a very clear picture of where people's heads are at. What advice would you give to a sort of CEO board member listening who's trying to achieve that goal? How do you go about that?
Well, I probably wouldn't do something as formalized as that, but what I have always used is, to my mind, one of the most important bits, the NED closed session, which I typically tend to do at the end because I like to reflect on what we've seen and use that to check in with people about, what are the priorities, what are the decisions we think we've taken, how we track to the next meeting. And so use if you like, the end of the first board meeting to figure out your interactions before the next one. Obviously, if things come up, you've got an acquisition or disposal or something like that, you need to time manage that. But most of the time, I think we're working in most boards on an evolutionary strategy. We've done the broad direction of travel before. We're now talking about, okay, do we need to pivot a bit more here, or is this in line, or is this particular deal making sense? And so you tend to be able, I think, to track it using the meetings as the tent poles of the progress. And then, to my mind, one of the most important is actually tracking decisions, which sounds really, again, basic. But you can spend 3 hours discussing a 5-year plan, and the plan is approved. And you're going, yeah, well, what actually have you approved? You know, you've got to talk, is there a change in capital involved? Have you stopped something? Have you started something? You know, be really crystal about that is super important for boards to know actually that where they are and what they're really doing.
There's that wonderful quote of a meeting without decisions is a wasted meeting, which always haunts me as a CEO.
I think there are times when you are just trying to noodle something out, and it's okay. It's all right to do it. But I always think it is an interesting challenge for any meeting to say, what have we decided, or is there something we have to decide? And sometimes, oddly, it's important not to take a decision too early, to the wrong time. So the judgment call on, brake, accelerator, but being clear about when a decision is a real decision, and then you've got to really hammer it home. Really important.
It's interesting. In episodes 134 and 135, Margaret Heffernan talked about the importance of sleeping on decisions and talked about the science behind that actually our subconscious continues to process decisions. And therefore, as a board, you should reach your conclusion. You should be clear about the assumptions. But, much like a consumer has the opportunity to retract a decision for a period of time, boards should be allowed that space. Is that something you do? How do you think about that?
I think it's a great point. Margaret's a very impressive person in terms of her insights. What I've tended to do is make sure that we have, particularly in the big decisions when you're coming up to a strategy sign-off or something like that, you have 2 to 3 chances to go around the debate. And often because different board members work at different speeds, they've got different thinking styles, you want to make sure people are fully engaged and involved. And the neuroscience is correct that you actually do have to give these things a bit of time, and your brain does process things. So if you have to make snap decisions, it becomes much more dangerous. And so I always prefer saying, look, we know we've got a decision coming up with a particular change in direction or a particular project. Can we have the first, let's just discuss this as a set of options, think about it a bit further, and then give ourselves time. So the last strategy process here at Landsec, I think we went through 3 iterations before we got to the public version, which was then a pivot in terms of where we're allocating capital. And during that, each time we went through it, it got better because we actually got deeper into the core of some of the issues, and we heard different things from different members of the board.
Can I go back to your second formative executive experience? You talked about being beaten up lightly by your audit chair at Kingfisher, and that he had identified something that you as CEO hadn't seen. What's the lesson from that? How did he pick that up for a board member listening, thinking, gosh, that sounds like value that I could be adding? How did he go about doing that?
Well, and the context was that before I became CEO, I was CEO of B&Q, but I was on the main board. So I was sort of seeing some of it, but he wasn't directing traffic at me so much as some of the others. So in classic exec terms, I probably said, well, I'm not being beaten up. That's great. Then it becomes your responsibility and go, okay, I've probably got to do something about this. And what Phil had done essentially had been going through with the finance teams, because he was a FD himself, and actually just looking at the state of controls in a much more forensic way than probably previous audit chairs had. And because of his, I think, combination of antenna and operational experience, he was just getting frustrated that things that were being identified weren't being addressed. And so it turned into an execution issue. And when I became responsible for said execution issue, then I then owned it. And it was an interesting example for me about, maybe the CFO should have fixed it on their own before. But when you're CEO, it becomes your issue, even if it's a technical functional role somewhere else. And you sort of do take it more seriously when you've got a really top grade NED telling you that, because they've probably seen this before somewhere else. And they, through a mixture of intuition analysis and digging, they've got the nose that something needs fixing. And it's often not completely obvious first time out what's causing some of these things. And actually you do have to get stuck in and go deeper. And that's what, good NEDs contributing can really help the radar for the CEO and the CFO.
One of the themes that regular listeners of Enter the Boardroom will have heard me talking about is what I call Cassandra syndrome, where after the Trojan priestess, where board members spot something and they're absolutely right on it, but they fail to take either the executive or other board members with them. You said wasn't a personal vendetta. So the way Phil had sort of communicated this with you and got through to you was clearly effective. Were there things that you learned from how he went about that beyond, you said he's clearly a top class and you obviously respected him. Was there anything else that he did beside that helped land that point with you?
I think he did two things. Firstly, he was persistent. And it's a lesson, I think, for NEDs that if they feel they've got something to say, they shouldn't just say it once and then go, well, I told you and you've done nothing about it. So you have to sort of carry on that ownership. And I think the persistence means that, eventually people do pay attention, and obviously ideally quickly, but persistence is actually quite important in NEDs and the way they can contribute. But secondly is I think there was a sense of this can be fixed. It's not just a whinge. It's not just grandstanding. It was, look, there is a problem here and it's not getting done, but this is how you might fix it. And as there's no one size fits all on these things, but once you've got something which is flashing red, you actually do need to sort of grip it. And at that point, the NED is arguably adding a lot of value because, again, maybe the CFO should have spotted it, but for whatever reason, we hadn't and it needed fixing.
That persistence point is really interesting because I've seen also the other end of that spectrum where people have become like a dog with a bone and then they get discounted because people think, oh no, here they are on that topic again. Was there a way that he trod that line so that you didn't start to sort of dismiss it?
I think the danger, I absolutely know that syndrome. And I think it sometimes depends on what the topic is and how meaningful and valuable the topic is. And if it's a minor hobby horse, people go, yeah, I've heard this story 3 times before, I'm not really going to listen to it. In this case, the controls issue was enough to say, look, no, we definitely got to take that seriously. And I think the lesson for the NEDs is, persistence versus broken record is an interesting balance. And you've got to work out whether you're having the right type of impact. But if you've got the courage of your convictions, as a NED, I would say, sitting down with the chairman and saying, look, I've really got an issue on this. Maybe not using all the airtime in the meeting because it does have a sort of slight distorting effect, but out of the meeting, absolutely go and sit down. And then for the chair, I think running the meeting, you've got to be quite careful about allocating time and bandwidth for people around the table. So if someone is literally just stuck on repeat, I would actually positively say, look, well, that's great. Why don't we talk about it after the meeting rather than, divert the meeting? And the judgment call in the middle is, is this serious? Is it not serious? Is it urgent? And how do we manage it? But the chair's got to be very alive to those sorts of issues.
Your third executive experience you talked about was how Peter Jackson, your chair at the time, helped you position that divestment of the business. Could you bring that to life in a way that a board member listening will find instructive if they find themselves in a similar position, having to help a CEO think through the positioning? Was it just about giving you space to think, or was it more than that?
I think it went in, and again, on sort of 2 or 3 steps. I mean, the first step was mutual recognition that we had a sort of emergency on our hands in terms of a need to bring down debt quickly. That didn't feel like that was in everyone's, if you like, sort of mindset. And I think people, if you talk to people now about the ancient history now of the GFC, it crept up on quite a few people. And a lot of big public companies thought they were fine and didn't really understand just how radically the lack of liquidity was going to impact. And banks literally were running away, trying to bring down facilities and get out. So helping the board get to actually, guys, we've got to do a step change rather than just trade our way out of this. Well, that was probably step 1 in that. And I think between us, we got to that reasonably clearly, which said, look, it needs to be something. The second part was, well, what is it? Which bit could you do? How would it work? What would make sense? And that's where the trade-off of saying a very saleable thing would be Screwfix. Not a good plan for our long term though, whereas Italy, although nice, was not strategically as well positioned as some of the others, but had a good property portfolio so we could actually cash some money in. And then there was other options we looked at as well. And getting the board to agree that was the right thing was Peter's contribution, which he sort of validated me as chief exec, I suppose, and as you said, gave me air cover, but allowed the conversation around the board table to happen at a point when I was ready to say, look, my recommendation is, and this is why, and I think this is the only game in town, but, let's have the conversation. And I think for boards, the board who had appointed me were sort of looking to see how I was going to navigate that first phase. I think everyone understood what I set out for the longer term, but this was the 6-month crisis phase where if we got it wrong, we could have been looking at a very dire situation indeed. And that sense of going through that together with a serious chair helping you as a CEO isn't, because CEO is, it's a cliche, it is actually a pretty lonely job. You do need someone who's got your back, even though that person can always, has to have the duty to fire you if you don't work out. But that relationship is so central, and it really made a massive difference as I found my feet as a new PLC chief exec.
So if I play that back, it sounds like really making sure the assumptions everyone around the table had were explicit and understood was the starting point, then mapping out the set of options you had, and then giving you the support and validation at the time when it was time to make a decision was the essence of what he did for you there.
Good description.
What's been the single most emotionally difficult board meeting you've had as the CEO?
Yeah, I've seen this as a question, and I've also had a slightly boring life because I haven't had any major, no crying in board meetings much yet. But I suppose the one that comes back to mind is actually probably the first one as Kingfisher CEO, stepping up from the divisional role at B&Q. And I've had a fairly firm idea of who I wanted to make some changes in the senior team. And broadly speaking, it was firing 2 very senior people who I felt weren't going to fit what I wanted to do, and that I had to do it. I felt at the beginning, as soon as I possibly could, like week 1 actually, and explained to the board that I was taking these 2 senior people out who they knew, and a couple of them were very attached to particularly one of the guys there. And there was a slight look of, does he know what he's doing here? Because also these were people who hadn't been part of my team. I'd been colleagues, I suppose, arguably. But I just knew that they weren't right for what we're trying to create, a one team approach, and it had to have very different sort of style. And explain to people that I was going to do it like now, and I could see a couple of board members getting very twitchy and wondering what on earth I was doing. And this, as opposed to talking about decisions for a long time, this was like bang, no, we're going to do it. And not having had the relationship with the board because you're a new CEO, even though I've been on that board and I knew most of them, but it's very different when you're the CEO. That stress level of going, I'm just going to do this and I've got to move at speed and you've got to trust me on this one. And that sort of slight intake of breath that you could feel around the room was definitely a sort of interesting moment, one that stays with me.
In episode 145, Thomas Toon Anderson talked about his experience as an executive, where I guess he was on the other end of that. And he was one of the people who was not in the in crowd and clearly felt that it was a very unjustified situation and it was about relationships rather than objective criteria. You talk there about getting the board to back you in that situation just based on trust. Did they push you for more objective criteria, or does it really boil down to, we think you're our CEO and therefore we've just got to trust your instinct?
I think a CEO in that situation has to articulate why, so, and without getting into the individual details, there were 2 very different reasons in 2 different places. One was much more about personal fit and integrity, and the other one was, I thought the person taking a function in completely the wrong way was obsessed with working a certain way and was trying to do things which made no sense. And for me as the CEO, the way I explained it is I said, look, this is frankly the sniff test here of am I as a new CEO going to be different and if effective? Because the danger as an internal candidate is everyone says, oh yeah, I know who you are, Ian, and that's all great and we're all friends and it's all cozy. And I'm to say, look, no, we are going to change, guys. This is going to be a step change from what happened in the previous run. And we are going to run things differently, starting with these 2 people are going because they do not fit what I want to do. And neither of them wanted to go. So it wasn't exactly a sort of cheery conversation, but it cleared the ground and got me into a position where I could say to the board, look, if I'm going to build my next team, which is my priority, I need to start with these changes, and this is why. At the end, it's a judgment call. So to your point earlier, it is a back me, trust me. And the danger of a CEO is if you make too many of those and they go wrong, you lose the trust. So you've got to be very thoughtful about it. But it was a really important starter for 10 in my first, literally week as a CEO.
As a non-exec and chair now, when a CEO says to you, back me, trust me, are there times when you're willing to do that, or do you push them for more evidence?
Yeah, look, I'm a big believer in the fact you've got to have logic behind a decision. And even if it's a personal judgment call, you've got to have a cogent argument. If you've got a cogent argument, then you then look at, do I believe this person's got the judgment right or wrong on this one? The challenge for a chair is that they've always got to have a little bit of distance. And you've got to have enough distance to be able to objectively assess something, because the ultimate thing you're assessing is, have you got the right chief exec and team? So you are the person in the shape of football manager, football chairman land, which is you back people until you have to sack them. And that means you've got to keep it slightly sort of remote, and you can't just take everything at face value and say whatever you want to do. But a good chairman-CEO relationship hopefully has dealt with a lot of the sort of tussle and challenge and discussion, probably well outside the boardroom and certainly in the regular one-to-ones you've got to have. And so when it comes to the board point, you've probably got 95% of the things thrashed out already, but maybe not sort of overtly discussed in the board. And then it does look maybe a bit more like it is backing the CEO, but you've done the challenge quietly beforehand.
Has there been a moment where as a CEO you felt the board or a board member got it badly wrong?
I've seen the individual judgments, which I remember thinking that's daft. And collectively, boards, do occasionally get stuck. And they, as I was saying earlier on with B&Q, I think we, as a board, and since I was on it, I should take responsibility as well. We carried on with that because the management team were pushing it and we didn't push back enough, and we could have stopped the overreach earlier, but that was the deal. That was the way it was running. I don't think I've seen too many things where you think, God, that's catastrophically wrong, because on the whole, I've been lucky enough to work with pretty impressive people who've taught me a lot, and I valued, even if I didn't agree with some of their views, I would always be interested in why and what's behind that and what alternative might that suggest. So I've on the whole not seen too many complete disasters.
And one of my favorite questions to ask people who've had deep sector expertise is, what are the heuristics or frameworks you would offer to a board member listening to this who wants to understand the retail space so that they can get on top of the value levers as a board member? It was Paul Pester talking about banks in past episodes. We had Tamara Box talking about professional services. You often hear people saying retail is detail, but what is the heuristic that you use as a board member now to get your head around a retail business?
Well, I think the essence of retail is still pretty basic about customers, and it's one of the things that sounds like a platitude, but actually a lot of organizations drive you away from the customer because it turns into process and internal, look at the engine under the cover rather than out. And the brilliant thing about retailing is that customers always tell you, because they actually, give you real money or not, depending on whether you get it right or not. And I was always very lucky to be able to try lots of things in retail, because you could set up a trial store, you could, change things, and you find out really quickly. So the direct customer connection is one of the joys of retail, as opposed to, building a massive office block that takes 5 years and you don't know necessarily how it'll work out in the end. And I think that gives the other thing that gives to retail is ability to constantly change and constantly innovate and constantly try. It's not a fire and forget type industry. You have to really work at it. And it means you have on the one hand, a very high metabolic rate in retail, because you're constantly going, have I sold anything in the last hour? Have I done anything? Have I changed something? So you're much more dynamic than lots of other industries, I think, as opposed to, say, frankly, in the property industry now, it's the board takes 500 million pound decisions a year and finds out in 7 years whether it got it right or not. Whereas this is very day to day. And in the middle is probably more common what we're doing in retail at Landsec, where we're running shopping centres. And we're having to think like retailers, because that's, property is only valuable if someone wants to do something valuable in it. And actually understanding retail models better makes us better landlords, and we can figure out, how to make that the landlord contribution to making the retailer succeed, which is the essence of what we're doing. So understanding retail for us is directly relevant. But then maybe the final thing on retail I would say is that it's had some of the more interesting transitions of bricks and mortar to multi-channel that I've seen parallels in banking and in TV, for example. This is a common theme of how do you go from an old model to a new model and survive the mind the gap moment in the middle. And retailing in particular has to now work out how it integrates all these options. So the shops that are there, but the e-commerce and the mix between the two, and then the customer data that provides the glue for all of that to come together. And then the ability now to exploit technology, which is not technology that you've invented, but it's what's happening. So my favorite question for boards is look what happened to retail once the iPhone was invented. I bet most people's 2007 business plans did not have the word iPhone in it. And it lands on you like a spaceship from outside, and bang, what was theoretically possible before suddenly becomes real. And the invasion of e-commerce becomes, warp speed at that point. And you have to react and work out how you change. And I think retail is, the essence of it is continuous change.
In episode 149, Mark Window made an interesting observation on retailers that every time they bring in a new CEO, you tend to see an uplift in performance because the CEO goes back to focusing on the customer, which was your sort of starting point there. I guess for a board member listening, is there a way that they can ensure that customer focus stays consistent rather than needing to bring a new CEO each time? What's going wrong there in your experience?
Yeah, I think it's probably not a case in all organizations, but there is sort of cycles in companies I've seen. And if you take something as massive and amazing as Tesco, it lost focus at one point post Terry, I think, wasn't really focused on the customer, was doing lots of diversifications. And then, Dave Lewis and co brought it back to its core. And I think you have to, as a board member, ask yourself, is there a danger you're in a cycle where you are drifting away from the core? And, the killer question is, what are these three new things going to do relative to the actual main business? And is the main business getting the airtime in the board that it needs? And that would, for me, would be a major warning flag, as if the entire board was spending all its time on shiny new toys and diversifications, and then had lost touch with the fact that actually its core business wasn't getting the level of attention it needed. And that is a cycle that is fairly classically common, because management teams get bored and want to do something different. And I think boards have to be really ruthless about saying, look, the 5 big things that matter here are these. Let's keep talking about that.
That's all we have time for with Sir Ian in this episode. We covered a lot. What executives only really understand once they've sat on a board, how CEOs can work effectively with their chairs and non-executives, and how boards add value when it really matters. In part 2, we pick the conversation up as Sir Ian moves from his executive career into his experience as a non-executive and chair, including how boards handle activist shareholders, crisis situations, AI and technological disruption, and what really distinguishes effective boards. So do join us next time for part 2 of our conversation with Sir Ian.